I am Dorothea de Lawousse, founder of the Normandy Institute, here on the hallowed ground of the Battle of Normandy. I'm honoured to present the D-Day 77 tribute film, Personal Stories from Members of Congress. My own parents' lives were formed by their experience in World War II. My father in a Japanese concentration camp, and my mother in Nazi-occupied Holland, where famine raged in that last brutal winter. The United States and its allies, through a miracle of inventiveness, science, technology, and sheer determination, became an unstoppable force. World War II still serves as one of our deepest reservoirs of knowledge and experience. The great American capital stood proud in the fog of war and inspired mankind to prevail at all cost. The fate of humanity hung in the balance. We thank members of Congress, past and present, for their tribute to the greatest generation.
There on the beaches of Normandy, I began to reflect on the greatness of the generation that first had their lives marked by the Great Depression, when everything was about sacrifice, when everyone had to work together just to get through life, including my parents. And then World War II, and how they responded to the greatest war in the history of mankind and did nothing less than save the world.
The French people will always remember the courage of the American soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied forces who fought for our freedom and lost their life by thousands and thousands. Your personal stories illustrate perfectly why World War II matters. Our countries are still strong allies. Vive les États-Unis d'Amérique. Vive la République et vive la France.
It's hard to believe that nearly 77 years have passed since D-Day. D-Day was the day that changed the world.
My dad, now 97, was born on Flag Day, June 14th. He fought in the Burma Theater. He fought for the Army Air Corps. There was no Air Force then. And he was one of the first to be given top secret clearance and learn radar.
For me, this is personal. My mom and her parents were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust. When the Nazis invaded, they were forced to separate.
My Uncle Manso, Uncle Nobi, and Uncle Etz all served in the 442nd Infantry Regiment. And looking back now, it's poignant to think about what it would mean to serve in a segregated fighting unit.
As a young boy at the time, I remember having family members who served in that war. It was a war that brought the United States together.
My father was a 37-year-old attorney with the Justice Department. He was asked by Justice Robert Jackson to join him at the Nuremberg trials.
My dad, Charles Hagel, was in the World War II South Pacific Theater of Combat for over 2.5 years.
In 1944, my father joined the Army and shipped off for Europe. In the spring of '45, alongside Allied forces that had been fighting since Normandy, he withstood brutal and desperate German resistance.
Known as the Buffalo Soldiers, the 92nd Infantry was a segregated all-black military unit. Among them was my beloved late father, Lieutenant Colonel Garvin A. Tutt.
He rarely talked about his service, but over the years, I learned he was one of the few who did all 4 combat jumps with the 82nd Airborne in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Market Garden.
I often think about my wife's uncle, my late wife's late uncle, Joseph Henry Washington, who was on the USS Arizona on that fateful day. at Pearl Harbor.
My father was a World War II veteran and a Purple Heart recipient. He was one of the first soldiers to land in Okinawa and was injured seriously there.
I see D-Day really through the eyes of the son of an immigrant who came to this country to escape persecution in Germany.
As the son of a World War II waist gunner on B-17s, I didn't hear my dad talk much of his experiences during the war. I wish I'd asked him more about that time in his life.
My father served on a marine transport ship in the South Pacific. He was in Tokyo Bay, one of the first ships in Tokyo Bay, marine transport ship, and he watched as the Japanese surrendered on the USS Missouri.
Think of both my dad, retired Navy chief, and my Uncle Bob. They both served in the United States proudly in World War II. My Uncle Bob died in 1944 at the age of 19 during a kamikaze attack in the Western Pacific on his aircraft carrier, the USS Suwannee.
My own father, Don Collins. In November of 1943, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserve Corps. He later saw action in Europe and fought at the Battle of the Bulge, where he was wounded twice.
May we all take a moment to honor the brave service members who answer the call to defend our country and fight for the ideals it was founded on: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Fred Wicker grew up in rural Mississippi during the depths of the Great Depression. On July 10, a few weeks after D-Day, he arrived across the channel to Normandy.
The memories of my father, who was a World War II Marine Corps dive bomber pilot, and he flew a great many missions. He had a brother killed flying Navy fighters off a carrier in the Philippines.
On a personal basis, my dad was a Marine on Iwo Jima, and I grew up hearing stories of the flag raising on Mount Sorbachi and the enormous combat that went on in taking that island.
My dad, Harold Thune, was a Navy fighter pilot who flew Hellcats off the USS Intrepid during World War II. He flew over 50 combat missions and went on to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross.
It was the spring of 1969 that my grade school bus driver, a World War II veteran and devoted member of the VFW in my hometown of Big Sandy, first asked me to play taps on my trumpet at a funeral for one of our nation's heroes. Playing taps for these veterans was my first call to public service, a small yet important part I could play in a much bigger story.
My father served as a navigator on a B-24 during World War II. He lived a great American success story.
Even though I was only 7 years old, I remember feeling great pride in being an American and supporting the war effort.
As a child growing up in the 1950s, World War II was our frame of reference. My parents met and got married during the war when my father was stationed out west. He was drafted even before Pearl Harbor and served in the Army Field Artillery.
I'm proud to be the son of a World War II veteran, an Army infantry lieutenant, and the grandson of a World War I Army infantry lieutenant. And I have always been inspired by the valor demonstrated by our troops on that fateful day, D-Day.
77 years later, the sacrifice, bravery, and courage of the soldiers who defended the ideals of freedom and justice will forever underscore the power of a collective, higher purpose.
It was there, in that icy water, on those blood-soaked beaches, and on the ragged cliffs, that thousands of men of valor faced the hellfire of tyranny, despotism, and evil. Before embarking on their mission, each one knew there was a good chance it would be their last.
During the war, my father served as a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He was attached to Eisenhower's command. While in France, he met a French woman named Madeleine who lived through Nazi-occupied France. They fell in love, married, and moved to Rochester, Michigan.
My grandfather, Major Deval Meter, served in the Battle of the Bulge. And he made it through thanks to the sacrifices of those he served with there and those who died on the beaches of Normandy.
I'm the daughter of a World War II veteran. I grew up hearing him tell tales of heroism displayed on and off the battlefield and have always been in awe of those who have served our country.
I'll never forget walking among the crosses, row on row. It is such a moving experience. And then coming across the grave marker of a fellow Vermonter, it brings a personal toll of the war achingly close to home.
I've been privileged to be able to go to Normandy officially on 2 different occasions. And to see those beaches and to see what these men accomplished is nothing short of a miracle. And as has been said, you know, the greatest generation.
My father, Malcolm McLean, was a fighter pilot during World War II, and he was there flying over the beaches of Normandy, providing cover to the troops that were landing down below.
Mobilized to go to war in areas most of them have never been to, all to defend freedom in this country. That includes my grandfather, Harry Kinzinger, who enlisted at the age of 25 from a farm in Illinois to join the Army Air Corps. And there's no doubt he's had a profound impact on my life, and he's my hero.
I was privileged in 2019, on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, to go to Normandy, to be there, and to recognize the significance of one of the most important days of the 20th century, and indeed any century as far as I'm concerned.
Well, my grandma was a Holocaust survivor who lost so much of her family during the war. As I took that drive and I spoke to her, she said, we had nothing to eat. She said, we ate grass and leaves. We had no freedom. We had nothing. And then, when American and Canadian soldiers came to liberate her town, everything. She didn't know any of those soldiers. She just knew that she owed them everything.
That picture is of my father, Gerald Huizinga, who 2 days before Christmas in 1944 was in a B-24 crash in Italy. It changed his life, was something that was massively impactful. In fact, he ended up convalescing at Percy Jones Hospital with Daniel Patrick Inouye and Senator Bob Dole.
My father was able to safely flee the Nazis in Poland during the Holocaust, thanks in part to the efforts of the Allied forces, particularly those of the United States. He came to this country and swore to serve it. For more than 30 years, he did that in the Navy. And when I came of age, I too felt that I owed this country a debt, and I served in the Air Force.
But my grandfather, also named John Hoven, was in his late 30s, almost 40, when he enlisted in the Navy. He served on the USS San Francisco, one of the most decorated ships of World War II.
In my case, I'm the grandson of Robert Andrew. He was instrumental and worked very, very hard in the development of radar. And you have to think back on the fact that December 7th, 1941 might not have been a successful Japanese attack if we'd had reasonable or even advanced radar at the time.
As the daughter of a World War II veteran who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, it was humbling to meet and personally thank veterans who fought for our country and for freedom, just as my father did.
Simply stated, the D-Day landing was one of the most consequential military operations in the history of the world. The success of the invasion changed the world for the better, and it came at a heavy price, and that's why we remember D-Day.
My father was a major in the Army during that period of time, and he was busily training the soldiers that would step off the boats onto the beaches at Normandy.
I'm standing in Arlington National Cemetery. This is the grave of my grandfather, Luther Sexton Fortenberry. He was killed in Normandy, France in November of 1944.
My father served in the Pacific Theater, working for the Army Corps of Engineers. My father built airfields and bases so that our military would have the backing to keep fighting.
When I stood on that hallowed ground and walked through the cemetery, fathers buried next to sons, brothers buried next to each other, it had a transformational effect on me.
My father enlisted at 17 and arrived at Normandy in the early morning hours of June 6th, serving in the 101st Airborne Division. He was one of the fortunate few whose glider remained intact on landing near St. Mary Clays.
John wore a lot of titles: congressman, chairman, outdoorsman, father, friend, and my husband. But I think that the title he was most proud of was being a veteran.
My father, that guy right there, Staff Sergeant Bernard Deutsch from Chicago. who fought in the Battle of the Bulge, the 84th Infantry Division. All of these guys fought together to defend our country. And then my dad came home and he raised a family, including those 4 grown-ups and that little guy there. That's me.
After Pearl Harbor, my father, who lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and was a recently admitted lawyer, joined the FBI and was assigned to their Manhattan office that dealt with counter-espionage, where clearly there was lots of cells of Nazi sympathizers and saboteurs that really were actively working to undermine the war effort, particularly regarding the industrial base of our country.
As a young boy at the time, I remember having family members who served in that war. It was a war that brought the United States together.
When I think of World War II, I think in particular one of the many heroes who served, former U.S. Senator Paul Douglas. I was a college student at Georgetown University here in Washington, the son of an immigrant from East St. Louis, when Paul Douglas, that great senator from my home state of Illinois, decided to hire me as a college intern in the Senate. In fact, Dr. Martin Luther King called him one of the greatest of all senators.
I will certainly never forget how we were able to celebrate the 75th anniversary, where I was able to jump out of the original C-47 that led the invasion fleet, was able to jump over St. Mary Glees to honor our forefathers who truly liberated the world.
On June 6th, our hearts are heavy as we remember the lives lost on Normandy's beaches. But we're also filled with gratitude for the courageous men and women who fought to save our nation and, frankly, the entire world. More than 180,000 South Carolinians joined the fight during World War II, and a few years ago, I had the distinct privilege of celebrating their sacrifice and their bravery in Charleston. I'll never forget shaking hands with these courageous men and women, members of the greatest generation, and thanking them for their service.
And like a lot of folks with family members that served in World War II, I get to thinking about my dad. He served as a B-17 pilot flying in the 303rd Bomb Group in the 8th Air Force stationed in Molesworth, England. They were known as the Hells Angels. On his 26th mission, his plane was hit several times by enemy fire. He and the rest of the crew bailed out at 20,000 feet, and they were captured near the French border and sent to Stalag 13D, a POW camp in Nuremberg, in what can only be described as awful conditions.
Right here is a portrayal of General Eisenhower telling the 101st Airborne just before D-Day, "Let's go." And then the whole theme of this memorial is Normandy at peace. You can see the tapestry that stretches all across 2 blocks here in Washington, D.C. And it's a little impressionistic, but that is D-Day, and that is Normandy at peace now.
I have been honored to be the Congresswoman who introduced the legislation to establish the National World War II Memorial on our National Mall. The memorial stands as a guardian to the lasting memory of the greatest generation. The memorial was built to ensure that future generations, who might never have had the opportunity to meet firsthand the members of the greatest generation, may know their sacrifice.
Some moments in history produce leaders willing to stand for what is right. World War II produced an entire generation.
And then they came home and gave us the America that we all enjoy today. The America that will always have a very special mark on the history of our time. And so I can say easily at this stage in my life, thank you, greatest generation. God bless.